Hey, we're going to talk now about evolution. It's a very, very complex issue, but it's very divisive, and it's time we really wrapped our head around it. Hi, I'm Michael Shevack. Welcome to GODSEARCH. We are barreling through podcast after podcast on so many things. Please reach out to yourgodsearch.com and continue asking the questions, and I will continue to try to answer them. Evolution is a very dangerous topic. It is something which hurts people on a deep level because it's one of these theories that goes to the heart of some of the difficulties in religion and also some of the difficulties in science. It has people who are very religious and very doctrinal and very biblically based, and they deny evolution. They do it in part because of their own beliefs, which they do not want violated, such as the perfection and inerrancy of the Bible. People who are scientific, they have difficulties with the religious view because it does not jive with the evidence in natural science. And you have two completely different camps. But if you look closely at the issue of evolution, you will see that, as with all things in this incredibly perfect reality in the larger level, not on the human level where it needs to be perfected, as in the discussion of evolution and in religion and science. But if you look carefully, you'll see that the two camps are there because, as we say continuously on God's search, where there is a conflict, there is missing knowledge. Let me just go over quickly some of the basic religious issues. The basic religious issues is, of course, the authority of the Bible and the authority of religious practitioners, and their religions and their authority systems that are based upon following the Bible as a manual for civilization and the deriving certain laws from biblical teachings and biblical canons. Darwin's theory of evolution undermines human authority systems, which are representative of divine authority systems. It has a way of doing that. I'll give you a perfect example in the Hebrew Bible, which is the foundation for Judaism, it is the foundation for Christianity, it is the foundation for Islam. You know, animals are not supposed to breed with other species. There's a clear human beings are not supposed to breed animals with other animals that are of different species. And they're not even supposed to breed animals with plants. And yet, in the natural order, we see continuously that there is an intermingling between species, and there is an intermingling on curious levels, even between plants and animals. If you look at something like a euglena, that is an animal-like living organism, but it also has chloroplasts and certain kinds of, plant-like things. It looks like a little bit of a missing link. So the natural science and what appears to be the order of nature as it is portrayed in the Bible don't always jive together. It is complex. Um, but there is an issue in for religions, which is not simply matter of a faith and dogmatism. There are actually holes in the theory of evolution until recently that have made it very impossible to fully have spiritually minded people commit to it. One of these issues was that Darwin was very clear in The Origin of Species. There were many additions. He was very clear that evolution is driven by the individual organism, meaning I, as an individual, am the focus for my interaction with the environment, its effect upon me, on whether or not I can adapt to the challenges of the environment, will live to perpetuate my genes and therefore become a more dominant member of the species, and certain lineages of human beings will be favored by the environment and live to continue and take over the evolutionary thrust. So that's basic Darwinism is based on the individual. Although he used the term, species selection, there was no theory that he had developed which could explain how a specific species unto itself could possibly prosper and evolve preferentially over others, or different groups within the species. So it's obvious a few things emerge from Darwinism that causes religious problems. One, it is so individually based that it has a spiritual component, but it doesn't have a moral component. Religions are very, very much traditionally moral systems, and moral systems require the responsibility of the individual to the group, and the group as a whole affecting the growth and spiritual progress of the individual. Well, in classic Darwinism, it was the individual that had the relationship with the environment around, the relationship with life, we call it here on GODSEARCH. But as a group, there was no mechanism that he could imagine by which the entirety of that group could itself evolve. Now, what that means in terms of classic religious thinking is that you couldn't have an Abraham or a Sarah. You couldn't have an individual and a group which could be bred to have greater selection by the environment over other groups. Whether you call it selection in Darwinism, or whether you call it chosen in theology, it's basically the same concept. God's promise to Abraham and Sarah in the Bible, which is that they will be fruitful and multiply, and that their legacy will be as enormous as the sands on the shores. That's basically a Darwinian promise, that you will have a greater alignment to the environment, to creation, and because of that, you will have greater adaptability and greater longevity and continuity. You will be chosen. You will have greater selection, to use the Darwin term. Both theories, whether it's a religious theory that chooses God, has God choosing a particular genome, a certain, subphylum of an Asiatic family called Hebrews, to have them favored, or whether you're talking about that in terms of Darwin's language, it's basically the same thing. Darwin's original mechanism did not provide for species species selection or group selection. It was always focused on the individual. That did not permit morality to be part of the theory of Darwin, which is a very curious thing because Darwin himself was the son of a Protestant minister. And it's fascinating that it was given to him as his task to kind of recreate a connection, a living connection between the earth and the species, and the rise and flourishing of different forms of life, which is the very thing that his father's theology at that particular moment in time, 19th century, was missing. As I keep saying, where there is missing knowledge, you will have conflict. And where there is conflict, There will always be missing knowledge, and you will discover, if you pay close attention to life, that there is always a motion in place to find the missing knowledge and discussion. Even today, this debate between religions and science over evolution is very much part of the spiritual dynamism that's involved in seeking the truth, with religious people playing one end of the spectrum, such as the distinction of species, the orderliness of species, their intention under God's design, and the morality that is part of life and is a necessary part of life and its survival. And in scientific terms, what is it that we can know for sure by human observation of how reality works, how life works for good, i.e., the survival of a species? They're both dealing with these same issues, but they're dealing with it from different perspectives. Now, evolution, as Darwin conceived of it back then, was seriously difficult for religions to entertain. What people do not realize is that there has been a great advance in evolution since Darwin. And it's not popularly publicized, and it's not discussed in religious communities. Religious communities oftentimes dig in their heels, and they're very dogmatic about refusing to enter evolution into their thinking. That obstinacy is there because there is great fear that you would lose faith if you entertained this idea. Not across the board. The Catholic Church has been very, very vocal and very public about the fact that evolution does not undermine their understanding of God, nor their understanding of universal redemption. There have been great scholars like Teilhard de Chardin who did a marvelous job of integrating evolution and sacred theology. There have been many, many, many rabbinic scholars that have done a marvelous job of doing that. There are people who are looking to do this and are trying to find innovative ways. But the most exciting thing recently is in the advance of macroevolutionary theory. Now, I'm not a biologist. I have some training in it, but I'm not a biologist, and I don't like to talk about subject matters that are not areas of my expertise, so forgive me, and I may make certain mistakes. So if you're a biologist out there, feel free to call me and tell me what I got wrong. Nonetheless, I do want to comment on it. In macroevolutionary theory, which is a more advanced form of Darwin's theory, there are certain mechanisms that have been elucidated that seem to have been proven true, meaning it can be experimented upon by multiple people in multiple times and produce the same insights and results. That's the scientific method. And one of those things in macroevolutionary theory has shown a mechanism by which there can be group selection, group choice, a favoring of one particular group as a group, not just as individuals as part of a group, but the group itself. And it can evolve as a group. Now, once you have that mechanism for evolution in place, you now have explained a Sarah, an Abraham. You can understand why there might be a chosen people or a select group of people to have evolutionary favoritism relative to other groups within the species. I'm not saying it justifies the Bible. I'm not saying it says the Bible story is 100% true, but it does not conflict with the assertion of the Bible. In fact, it supports it. Another thing that's fascinating about macroevolutionary theory is that what emerged out of it was a brilliant insight by Niles Eldredge, who's a paleontologist at the Museum of Natural History in New York. And Niles had this amazing insight into Darwin's theory. One of the aspects of Darwin's original theory was that evolution takes place in geologic time, meaning according to how geology works on the planet. Well, there were certain problems in that emerged, and religious people noticed the problems, and they correctly noticed the problems, as did scientific people. And one of those things is if you have a smooth continuity of time in geology, and smooth growth of evolution in species that are tested by the environment. And because they have a kind of survival of the fittest, they are more in alignment to the environment and can grow and flourish and survive more because you have those. And the smoothness of the geological progression of time and the smoothness of the evolutionary process, one would expect in the fossil record that there would be a continuous growth of evolution, a continuous stream of evolution. But in fact, there isn't. It's broken into pieces. And there are periods of massive evolution and periods where there's an absence of evolution. It's fascinating. Now, no one knew why, but Niles Eldredge, God bless him, had an absolutely brilliant insight. And he said, what if the spaces on the geologic time frame are not a mistake? They're not a mistake. They're not a denial of Darwin's fundamental theory, but they're an indication of how evolution actually works. And he, together with the great paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, may he rest in peace, Stephen Jay Gould named it, he was very good with words, he named it punctuated equilibrium. And the theory was that evolutionary process happens in spurts. It will happen. You'll have, for instance, in the what's that? I forgot the name of that era where you'll have a flourishing of species of all kinds, and then it will kind of shut off, and it will have what's called stasis, and there will be not a massive growth of new animals and new species and new living organisms. It will kind of stop. And that, instead of being viewed as a mistake in evolution, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould laid out the dynamics of punctuated equilibrium and said this is actually how it happens. And they went back and they looked at all of the experiments in the past that didn't make sense on why there was this kind of structure to the evolution of different, animals. And they applied the theory of punctuated equilibrium to it. And lo and behold, a lot of these past enigmas straightened themselves out very well. And the theory proved to be very, very true. The fascinating thing is that if you take a look at punctuated equilibrium, there is roughly, not completely, roughly a ratio of 7 to 1 in terms of the amount of time in stasis and the amount of time in flourishing. In other words, God's activity to produce new life, and then you have a period of 7. Well, the 7 to 1 pattern you may recognize very well from your Bible as the creativity of God, God's return to God's creativity on the Sabbath, and the flourishing of human life activity during the week, where human activity ceases. And on the weekend, you remind yourself of God and creation who has his own pattern. The 7 to 1 pattern was an ancient pattern that was, witnessed within ancient civilizations. And it was witnessed there not because it was simply a religious artifact or a religious belief. It had its foundation in observation, in human experience. That's why here on God Search, we say that you are to have an experience of God. Yeah, you may be an observant person in terms of your religious teachings, and that's beautiful, but you also have to be observant in terms of how life works for good. Science is there to reveal to us the laws of nature no differently than they can be recorded in scripture in the form of an Abraham or in the form of cycles of seven, which are common during the Sabbath, common in the Jubilee year and the Jubilee of the Jubilee year. These things were part of living life. They are not at odds with each other. Macroevolutionary theory allows evolution to be supportive of the fundamental life experience, which is biblical, and the fundamental life experience, which is biblical, which is the foundation of those particular religious cultures. It does not support the view that the sky opened and the species dropped whole from life. Now, there have been many conflicts that have gotten bitter as people attempted to control the power systems of schools and stuff to indoctrinate their children. And in fact, not recently, it's been a while, there was a kind of contest between evolution and a competing religiously inspired theory, um, which was irreducible complexity, it was called. A professor in Pennsylvania had that theory. And there was a kind of contest out of it. And it was done in a court system. And the evolutionists who were scientific kind of proved that their view had some truth because they predicted based on their theory on how the gorilla chromosome, which is missing one relative to us, they predicted that that missing chromosome was due to a fusion of two chromosomes, and they predicted that there would be centromeres, which are little bands on each chromosome. There would be double centromeres that would indicate that there was a fusion of two chromosomes into one. And they showed how their theory of evolution was able to predict that that would be found in the gorilla, which in fact it did. The fact is, there is no doubt from a scientific point of view, meaning strict observation of life, that evolution exists. There is no doubt. There is refinement and further understanding of how it operates. Macroevolutionary theory is an example of a refinement of Darwin's original thinking, which allows not just for selection in the individual, but selection as a group. So you can have a chosen person, such as an Abraham. You can have a chosen group, such as the Hebrew people or the elect in Calvinism, or any particular religious group which aligns itself to the laws of God and therefore has a greater flourishing and vibrancy and continuity. When you take a look at that and you realize that the individual's experience and the individual's own spiritual growth contributes to the flourishing and the continuity and the survival of the species, and that the species, as it adapts certain kinds of behaviors and cultures that allow the individuals themselves to grow and flourish more, you realize how important macroevolutionary theory is. Now, when one reads the Bible nakedly in the first chapter of Genesis, there clearly is an evolutionary sense in terms of which creatures come first and which creatures come second and which creatures come third and which are more advanced than others. You can see that the human being is created by God last. There is a clear sense of evolution. But when you're dealing with Darwin's teachings and when you're dealing with scientific theories, it deals with only one aspect of truth, which is, as we talked about earlier, is what can be proven. It doesn't always deal with the substantial truth, which the living, breathing human life experience, which is part of the spiritual dimension of life. The scientific, rational, and provable is an important part of human knowledge and the seeking of human knowledge. The other aspects, which are the intuitions, the insights, the intuitive gleaming of understanding order and mechanism, even though you can't prove it. You know, you do not know the equation of love, and then you can feel it, feel love even without knowing its equation. How do you like that? Well, oftentimes the substantial aspects are discarded as unimportant. They're not as important. Oh, they're the female aspects. And that the male aspects, which are dominance and understanding, get greater importance. Well, neither one should disparage the other. They're both faculties of truth. Faculties of truth. So evolution has to be integrated into your personal experience of God and creation and spirituality. And if you're going to have a religion that has any real sense to it that corresponds to truth, actually objective truth, your religions are going to have to evolve to harmonize with this other view of truth that human beings are capable of. Also, as you will discover as you stay on your God search, and you discover day to day, moment to moment, your own sense of evolution, where you are increasingly coming into alignment, into covenantal awareness of the relationship of yourself to the group of which you're a part, the effect of group changes upon you psychologically and your ability to survive, your ability to grow, your ability to flourish, all of which are spiritual qualities. As you begin to experience this personally, you will begin to get a sense of evolution, not just planetary evolution of all the different species, but also of your personal evolution, which is part of it. I cannot go into all the dynamics of the personal evolution and how personal evolution affects the planet and affects all the species. But in fact, it does. Evolution exists. There is an evolutionary impulse that is built into you and other creatures in the world to flourish and produce greater advancement and greater ability to enflesh, to incorporate, to house, and develop more advanced systems that allow the intelligence that is part of the divine experience, the sense of actual affinity and love, which is part of the divine experience, and the higher levels of mind, all three things we talked about in the past two podcasts, and the experience of higher orders of mind, all of these come to bear in evolution, not just in you personally, but for yourself, your group, your family, your species, all species. And there is very little doubt as we enter a new era where we're not as earth centric. The Bible is extremely earth centric if you look in the first chapter. But as we begin to approach other planets, and there are more than enough rumors right now of life having existed on Mars, and certainly there could be on other planets as well. Evolution is, as we spoke about earlier, cosmic. Cosmic evolution, the continual progression and flourishing of life, the intelligence, the love, the higher order of being that produces scales of ascending orders of mind and greater, more advanced species and greater advanced flourishing of planets and realms to live in. All of this reaches out from our humble little planet on the third rock from the sun and embraces the entirety of whatever is, in fact, our universe or universes beyond that. We do not know the scale of evolution. So if you're a religious person, I encourage you, even if you have your firm beliefs on the Bible, which I share because I'm Bible based, even if you do, that you consider strongly the truth of evolutionary theory and look at it objectively as a mechanism that was brought into the world at the same time as creation. Already, many fundamentalist groups have acknowledged the fact that evolution clearly exists on a microevolutionary basis. There is no doubt about it. The influenza virus mutates clearly every single year. Bacteria become resistant to certain antibiotics. It's very clear there is an evolution on a on a microscopic level. The fear is the loss of speciation, where the individuals are not separated properly. The fear is that Darwin's original platform did not permit the individual relationship and the group relationship, and therefore it did not address what we religious people might call a soul. It did not address the relationship of an individual to understanding the purpose and momentum of his group to which he belongs. It did not address the relationship of the individual's consciousness to the consciousness of other animals and plants of which he or she is a living part. It did not address the relationship of angelic beings, or what we might call aliens, that visit and guide and may have different scales of power. All these things were missing. So I call on everyone to let's put this war between science and religion aside. Let's let Darwin off the hook. His theory was incomplete. His theory remains incomplete. There are many things that have to be learned in order to create a more cogent theory of evolution. I've been working on it on the side. I think I've made some headway. And eventually, this knowledge will flourish in a way that because you're dealing in one reality and you experience life and you write down discernments on how life works for good, and you'll write it in scripture or you'll write it in a different form in scientific understandings. This knowledge, this unified knowledge gained from different disciplines on how life works for good, for the experience of increased evolution and advancement, and that we are imbued more with the image and likeness of God, well, more and more and more and more, these different disciplines will approach the truth horizon, the unity horizon, and we will use it for the advancement, meaning the cause and effecting of a better life for ourselves and everyone. For this generation and future generations, we will be, as human beings, supernatural that we are, supernatural, not merely of the earth. We will be conscious creators, not just animal creators that are follow the impulses in nature in us with very little conscious input, relatively speaking. We will be more conscious creators, more conscious animals. And these difficulties in doctrinal teachings and scientific teachings and these so-called theories that people are treating as if they are absolutely fixed, you know, fixed idols. Well, hopefully we're not going to be so rigid, and we'll allow the interimpregnation of one theory and the other into the other, and we will grow in truth through scientific insight, and we will grow in truth through religious insight, which includes not just the spiritual, but the moral, and as we spoke about earlier, the legal and the ethical and the historical and the cosmic. We will grow towards that too. There is no conflict to a true God search. It is all an evolutionary process which will engage every aspect of your life if you give it your full commitment. And if part of that is giving evolutionary theory as a scientist your full commitment and lending your life force to its development and the unveiling of truth and goodness and unity within that, then you yourself have contributed to the covenantal exploration of all life, which is the great human gift. So thank you, please, again, for being here on God's Search. Come again every Wednesday about 5:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Uncover God, discover God, and please recover if things like the battle over evolution have destroyed your ability to connect your heart to the gift of the faith that you were given. Please rethink it. Rethink it. There is nothing to fear about knowledge, which is truly pertinent and truly in alignment to the way this world works for good. That is the God experience. I'm Michael Shevack. Thank you again for being here on God's Search. Bye bye.